Chris Christie tried to dislodge himself from the Pluffian barrel today with a town hall meeting in Moorestown, New Jersey. And we dispatched Mark to be our eyes and ears at the event. Mr. Halperin, tell us what you saw.
Well, this was a first time he's done a town meeting in months in New Jersey, and the audience here was respectful. There were none of the huge YouTube moments that you've seen and have made these town halls famous. I talked to Governor Christie after the event very briefly. I asked him about people saying that he's dead, that his candidacy for president isn't going anywhere. He said that was overstated, and he said he was an underdog in the sense that Jeb Bush, he said, is the son of a president, brother of a president, of course is the front runner. But he said if he decides to run, he'll be in tough. I also asked him about that New York Times story that we talked about on the show from a couple weeks ago, in which they talked about the luxurious lifestyle that he has led. We didn't get into the specifics of the story, but he said that he was ready for that kind of scrutiny if he does run. In the town hall itself, a lot of nuts and bolts questions. The guy showed that he is still very much immersed in governing this state, although he's been traveling quite a bit. Detailed questions on fiscal policy, as always in these meetings, questions about Sandy, recovery. He got a question about Atlantic City. The big thing he talked about in his opening statement was about this deal that he's reached, tentative outlines of a deal to go forward with the teachers' unions to deal with the pension crisis this state is facing. He talked about that as a model for how he's worked in the past in New Jersey and how he's working now.
We're not going to solve this by yelling at each other. We're not going to solve this by pointing fingers at each other. We're going to solve this by working together. That's what I've tried to do the entire time I've been governor. Sometimes I have to yell and scream to get people to work together. And I do that sometimes. But ultimately, in a state like ours, when you're a Republican governor with a Democratic legislature and more of your citizens being in the opposite party than in your party, you want to get something done, you got to reach your hand out and be willing to compromise and to work with them.
Now, as we talked about yesterday, that is the message that got him to the national stage, being tough with public employees unions, but getting a compromise with Democrats. I didn't sense the crowd was electrified by that message, but it's clearly now the way he wants to go forward, both in the state and present himself nationally.
Yeah, I mean, that's the old Chris Christie, Mark, and that's the Chris Christie that seemed a year or so ago, before Bridgegate, who seemed like a formidable possible Republican frontrunner. I guess my curiosity, that I'm curious about, is whether just been so much that's been inflicted on him in the time since, whether he can try. I can understand why he's trying to get back to that place. I think the question is whether he can get back to that place given everything that's happened. I have some significant doubts about that. I'm curious whether you think that this is the beginning of him being able to reclaim that mantle, or if he's just whistling Dixie.
Well, he can certainly talk about it. Obviously, if he were elected president, he'd almost certainly have a Republican legislature in Washington to deal with. As I said, the crowd didn't seem particularly moved by that message. And, of course, the Democratic legislature now, while they were willing to work with him early in his first term, they don't seem at all inclined to give him more deals. He does need a pension deal, though. And I think that there could be a deal on pensions if he can keep the teachers' unions continuing to negotiate with him.
I mean, I think
let's talk about another thing. Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, one of the hard things about getting back to that message, I think, is for some people at least, there's still the memory of the Bridgegate thing and some of the other things that happened in that election in 2013 were places where, although the governor talked about cooperating with Democrats, he punished Democrats who didn't endorse him in that re-election fight. And people still remember that but people have to wonder how much of this talk about getting along with Democrats is actually belied a little bit by some of the things, the tactics they engaged in that race. Anyway, on to the next SOT.
Yep. The other thing he talked about today a lot in his opening statement and then in response to some of the questions was taxes. That is obviously a huge issue in the state. It has been for a long time when Republicans have been in power, Tom Kaine and Christie Todd Whitman before. It's always been a very hard-line anti-tax message. The state has high taxes now in a lot of categories. He talked today extensively and got the best reaction, I think, from the crowd for most of the day about read his lips, he will not raise taxes, and made fun of the current tax system in his own state.
We'll tax you for the temerity of dying, and then we're going to tax your grandchildren for the temerity of accepting the money from grandma or grandpa. We have our hand in your pocket at every stage of life.
So if he's not going to raise taxes, dealing with the pension issue, the transportation fund has been depleted,
right.
It's going to be difficult to do. And again, it's a very tax-sensitive state. I thought, though, he does have his voice on that. I'm not sure how he thinks Democrats are going to eventually try to pin him down on that, but he does not intend, he made it clear today, to even consider raising taxes, which, of course, in the context of running for president, would be poison.
Yeah, well, I mean, look, you got two different issues here. One is positioning and one is the reality of New Jersey. We discussed on the show yesterday, very hard to run if the New Jersey economy is in the tank. It is not a pretty picture down there. And so the question of whether he can try to get that economy back on track without raising any revenue and dealing with some of these problems, that's a big question. But then in the context of 2016, you can see him maybe trying to signal that he's going to move into a very aggressive anti-tax posture if he runs for president that might get him some kind of contrast and traction against Jeb Bush, who is going to be against taxes like all Republicans, but seems to be more interested in a targeted tax relief kind of agenda and not a big sweeping supply side agenda. Maybe supply side and sweeping is where Christie wants to go.
Right. Well, it'd be interesting to see in the context of running for president if he does have a tax reform plan. We've not heard much about anything like that from too many of the candidates, including him. Right. Almost all these questions were about state issues. They really were about Sandy relief, as I said, about the economy in Atlantic City, sure, about some health care policy issues. The one question he got that was the least bit related to national issues was this question about hog farming regulation in the state, which he said Democrats were trying to gin up to embarrass him. At the end, having not gotten any national issues, he closed the thing by brought it up on his own, this notion of continuing to govern New Jersey while he ponders running for president.
There's all this conversation, right, about me running for president. Easy now. And there's this sense or feeling that that decision will determine whether I do my job or not, okay, and whether I'm here or not. Now, maybe if I decide to run and if I ultimately won, I couldn't do both at the same time, nor would you want me to. But the point is that I am focused on this job. I can walk and chew gum at the same time.
John, the biggest thing I take out of both the town hall and my discussion with Governor Christie afterwards is this is a guy who understands he's got to have his temperament in check. There was not much to make him mad today, but I think he's determined to erase the image of him as an angry guy. Right. He's a funny guy. He's a charming guy. And the reason why I am nearly alone in saying that he's still in this hunt in a big way for the Republican nomination is he's got better skills at answering questions in a genuine way than almost anybody in the race.
Yeah, I mean, you're right when you say that I'm much more skeptical about this than you, but you could really say that it was happy, smiley Chris Christie today. You mentioned at the beginning that there were none of those YouTube moments that made him famous. I imagine that if he's seriously thinking about running for president, which he is, I don't think we're going to see many of those YouTube moments in the future. If it's up to him, I think he's going to try to stay on the happy warrior side of things rather than the old Chris Christie mode.